Hey, hi, hello. Welcome to Diana Emerson. Today we're listening to True Night Shift Gas Station Stories.
Room nurse at a large hospital, and I was working the night shift at the time. During my time on that shift, I saw many strange and shocking things. This story, however, is about the scariest thing that I've ever experienced. My shift began at 10 p.m. and went until 6 in the morning. It was a large hospital in the downtown core of the city where I live. There was a whole hospital district in the area. The children's hospital was right next door, and the cancer ward was not far off. It was a warm summer night. The city was dark as I drove my car into the staff parking area. The security guard checked my badge and waved me in. I parked and walked to the entrance, like I had many times before. When I stepped into the building, the somber tranquility of the night was replaced by the fast-paced hustle of a big city emergency room. You wouldn't even know it was nighttime in this place. The bright fluorescent lights shone down on the busy hallway, leading to a feeling that was indistinguishable from daytime. The next several hours were fairly normal by my standards. The job in general is incredibly hectic, and the night was no different. Basically, what I'm saying was that it was a typical crazy night. However, things were taken to another level when a new patient entered the emergency room. He burst through the front entrance covered in blood. Holding his abdomen, he trudged into the waiting room with a look of agony on his face. He looked to be about 40 years old, with long hair. He had a short beard and wore blue jeans. One of the other nurses and I approached him and helped him into the operating room. We cut his shirt off in order to find the source of the blood. His flannel shirt was heavy, having been soaked in blood. I think it was supposed to be yellow with a plaid pattern, but it was impossible to tell. All I could see was red. Looking at his bare chest, it was easy to see the wound. It was a clear knife wound on his stomach on the right side of his body. I quickly stopped the bleeding. His condition was stabilized. Believe it or not, this kind of thing was actually quite common. The other nurse and I were well within our ability to handle the situation. What happened next is what really terrified me. I was alone with the man. He was conscious but laying still. The stab wound was the only serious injury, but I couldn't help but notice several other injuries on his body. They were not bad enough to require emergency treatment, but there were noticeable scratch marks on his arms and face. They were deep, long marks in rows of 3 or 4. They had surely come from fingernails. My expertise is healthcare. I'm not a detective. I don't have the skills to analyze the meaning of a certain type of wound, so take what I say with a grain of salt. But these scratches looked defensive. I was almost sure of it. This man had done something to someone. My gaze moved slowly from the man's arms to his face. He turned to look at me at the same time, and we locked eyes. We held eye contact for several seconds. My mind was racing. Does he know that I know? I thought. Just then, he tried to reach out and grab my arm. Luckily, my reflexes were faster than his, and I quickly left the room. Fortunately, the police were already there, as is common when there's a stabbing. I told the officer what I had seen. He assured me that they would look into it. The man was treated for several more hours by my coworker, and eventually, the case was turned over to the police. I never found out exactly what happened between this man and whoever else was involved, but my intuition tells me that he was bad news. All I can do is hope that whoever the other person was, they got away in better shape than he did. I had been working at a local gas station for a few years at the time. It was the job I've had throughout high school, and after graduation, I kept it for a year or two while I was figuring some things out. I started doing the night shift when I no longer needed to get up for school. The pay was better, and I also preferred it for some other reasons. The store never got really busy at night. The pumps were automated, and almost everyone paid at the pump instead of coming in, so it was pretty easy. That, and I was a bit of a night owl anyway. Some would say that I was a video game addict, and they would be right. I was pretty much nocturnal anyway, so the choice to do the night shift was pretty easy. The gas station was on the corner of a quieter street. There were 4 pumps out at the front and a pair of dumpsters at the side. I would take the garbage out every morning at the end of my shift, and the garbage truck would come and empty them right after, as I was leaving for the day at 5 a.m. It was close to 4 a.m. and quiet so far. I don't think I saw more than 3 or 4 customers in the 6 hours that I'd been on duty. I stood behind the counter staring at my phone. I used this time to do some reading and browse social media. The empty store was silent apart from a dull hum from the fluorescent lights that hung overhead. I looked up from the screen of my iPhone when a car pulled into the parking lot. It was an older Pontiac with some noticeable dents and a green paint job with several rust spots. One strange thing was that the headlights were out. It was very dark, and driving around without headlights was downright dangerous at this time. It didn't go to one of the pumps, and I couldn't see where it parked. Thinking it was just somebody turning around, I went back to my phone. Not more than a few minutes later, I heard a loud crash from the side of the building where the dumpsters are. It sounded like someone had opened the lid and slammed it against the side of the building. Whoever was in that car must be throwing something out, I thought. People do that from time to time. It's not allowed, so I usually go out there and tell them that they can't use the dumpsters. I walked out from behind the counter and out the front door. As I made my way closer, a chill ran down my spine. Something felt wrong. Although I wasn't sure what it was, I decided to proceed with caution. I nervously peeked around the corner and saw the car parked in front of the garbage area. A dark figure stood next to the car, but I couldn't make out anything about him. It was too dark. I stood there for several seconds watching, but I couldn't tell what he was doing, although I know he must have been throwing something away. There was just something about this guy that gave me the creeps. I can't explain exactly what it was about him, but for some reason, I decided not to make myself known. I quietly crept back into the store and went back to my post behind the counter. A feeling of relief struck me when I saw the car drive out past the pumps. There was not another customer for the rest of my shift, which was only about another hour. Like I said, I take the garbage out every morning before I finish, so I gathered the few scraps of trash that were in each of the garbage bins throughout the store and packed them into a single large black garbage bag. I flipped the light switch on the other side of the building where the dumpsters were. While I was walking to the dumpster, I remembered the creepy guy from an hour before. Although it didn't occur to me to check what he had thrown out, I realized that I was about to find out. The bright bulbs shone down on the green bins like spotlights, as if they were an exhibit at some kind of a strange modern art gallery. I had to squint my eyes as I approached. When I reached the closest bin, I swung open the large lid and it crashed on the side of the building, causing that familiar noise. Before throwing the bag in, I leaned over and looked inside. What I saw left me so shocked that I dropped the garbage bag on the ground. There was a pile of black garbage bags, and at least one of them was dripping with a red liquid. I had seen enough. I ran into the store and locked the door and hid behind the counter. I frantically called 911 and told the operator everything, my hand shaking so much that I could hardly hold the phone. The police arrived quickly after, and sure enough, there was a body in the dumpster. I did my best to give them a description of the guy, but like I said, it was so dark without the lights on that I couldn't really tell what he looked like. I was, however, able to give them a description of the car, and based on that, they were able to track the guy down and arrest him. As of this time, he's awaiting trial for murder, and I'm expecting to testify as a witness. I've seen some strange things while working the night shift, but this is by far the scariest. Although terrifying, I continued to do the night shift for several more months. I've never experienced anything like this since, and I hope I never do again. My father used to work as a corrections officer at the state prison where we lived. Although he used to love the job, he left shortly after this incident. Considering what happened, I don't think anyone will blame him. He was working the night shift at the time. It was a pretty laid-back job for the most part. The inmates were all locked up in their cells during his shift. He used to tell me about some of the crazy things that happened during the day. Fights, riots, and everything you can imagine. The night shift, however, was really quite peaceful and relaxing. He used to say that once he got used to the sleep schedule, it was really the better option. My father would usually patrol the prison a few times per shift. Sometimes he would drive around in one of those guard trucks or keep watch in one of the towers. However, on this night, his boss told him to do a sweep of the prison chapel. There wasn't much to it, he told me. You just had to walk around and make sure that nobody was there who shouldn't be. He walked through the yard to the chapel. The large empty space gave off an eerie vibe. Bright floodlights on the prison wall cast a long shadow of my father's body as he trudged past the empty basketball courts. He came up to the front door of the chapel, and when he did, a wave of nervousness came over him. At the time, he didn't know why, so he pushed the large oak door open and stepped inside. He flicked on the light switch and started checking some of the small rooms at the front of the building. After a few minutes, a man walked out of the office at the back of the chapel. He seemed to be another guard. He was wearing the same uniform as my father. However, my dad didn't know this guy. That wasn't that unusual, since sometimes the guards from the day shift would take a night shift for extra money or to cover for someone. Even still, he was confused because his boss asked him to check the chapel. Why would he do that if someone was already there? My father asked the man, "Are you here to do a sweep of the chapel?" "Yes, I'll take it from here," the man replied. My dad stood there confused for several seconds, then said, "Oh, okay, I'll let the boss know." He left the chapel and walked back to his boss's office in the main building. His boss looked up from his desk and said, "How did you get done so fast? You couldn't have possibly checked the whole place in such a short amount of time." "Another guard was there. He said he'd check it out," my dad replied. "Okay, as long as someone checked it," the boss said. My dad was confused at this point. He figured the other guard must have been sent there by someone. If his boss didn't know, then who was that guy? 3 days later, my father was walking down the halls of the prison and stopped to look at the display case. There were various awards and old photos of other guards from times in the past. As he was browsing through the photos, he saw something that made his heart sink. One of the pictures was a memorial to a guard who had been killed in a riot about 20 years ago. The picture was of the guard that my father saw in the chapel that night. He had never been a believer in the paranormal before, but this experience caused him to change his mind. He didn't bother to tell any of his coworkers out of fear that he'd be ridiculed, and not long after, he left the job and made a career change. Although this was a terrifying incident for him, it is one of his favorite stories to tell. I've heard it more than a few times from him, and although I wasn't sure at first, I actually do believe it too. I'm a 27-year-old male, and I live in the UK with my fiance. I currently work as a teaching assistant for teenagers with special needs in a school not far from Bradgate Park. I've worked in a number of schools and children's homes now, and these buildings, especially the children's homes, are usually old renovated houses or halls. This story happened in 2013, when I had just started working as a support worker at a care home for teenagers and young adults, 18 to 30 years old, who had autism, brain damage, and challenging behavior. The house that I worked at was pretty big. There were 2 living rooms, a large kitchen, a games room, a study, and 5 bedrooms. There was also a huge garden with a summer house, an activity room that led to acres of fields and woodland. I had been working there for about 3 weeks, and primarily worked the waking night shift. This shift ran from 10 p.m. until 8 a.m., and it was my duty to make sure all the residents were settled for the night, and then get the cleaning done before the day staff came in to take over. I would usually get all my jobs done at around 1 a.m., and I'd spend the rest of the night listening to anyone that woke up. I would watch TV, read my university course textbooks, or just play some games on my phone once I was finished. The residents usually slept all night. On one particular night, a young man named James, not his actual name, was particularly restless. He was not very big, but he had a lot of strength behind him. One time, he got into one of his bad moods, and he threw a member of the staff through a patio door because she'd forgotten to put cold water in his tea before he drank it. He could not form full sentences, and would communicate with fairly simple words put together in a way that he understood. For example, he would say something like, James make breakfast, when he was ready to make breakfast, or James go outside, if he wanted to go out and play. He was generally well behaved, and could be quite funny when he wanted to be, but he was known for his temper. At around 11 p.m., James got up and came downstairs to make a drink. I stood in the doorway and watched to make sure he didn't break anything or hurt himself, and then he went back upstairs without any real bother. I sat on the top step and kept an eye on his door for maybe 15 minutes to make sure that he didn't wake any of the other residents. Once he had settled, I went back to my cleaning. The room beneath James's bedroom was a communal living room with board games, TV, sofa, books, and stuff like that. I was in there dusting and mopping the floor when I heard something drop in the room above. I knew James was prone to temper tantrums if he got frustrated, so I went up the stairs and knocked on the door. As I reached for the key to open it myself, he opened the door and looked at me. He seemed perfectly calm, and his eyes must have been half shut if he'd been asleep. I asked if he was okay. He said yes and put his thumb up. This was something he did when he was in a good mood and not stressed out, so I left him to it and told him to be careful, thinking that he had knocked something over by accident. An hour passed, and by then I was in the kitchen cleaning the sink. I heard another big bang above me, again like something had been dropped. This time I realized that the room above the kitchen was currently empty. The house had been set up for 5 residents, but there were only 4 at the time, and the room above me was the spare. I immediately went to check it out, but the room was empty. I stood there for a while, and as far as I could tell, everyone was asleep. Due to their conditions, each resident had an alarm fitted to their door that was activated at night. That way, if anybody left their room, a small receiver box would sound an alarm. The night staff carried around the box, and it made a little noise to indicate which door had been opened. The alarm had not gone off, so I knew that the noise was not from any of the residents. I got back to my cleaning and didn't hear anything else for the rest of the night. The following night, I got to work just before 10, and as I entered the hallway, I could tell that something was wrong. James was at the bottom of the stairs, covering his ears and humming loudly, and 3 members of the staff were with him. After a few minutes, he was escorted to the sitting room, and the house manager gave me a rundown of what had been going on. For the last 4 hours, James had been quite agitated and kept repeating the phrase, Sarah, little girl, when he was asked what was wrong. That was something we'd never experienced from him before, and the general conclusion was that he'd seen something on TV or in a movie that stuck in his head and made him repeat the phrase. Once James had settled in bed, the night staff left, and the other members of staff went to the staff bedroom. I got on with my tasks, and as usual, I finished around 1 a.m. Soon after, I went upstairs to do a quick check of the other residents. When I got to the first floor landing, I noticed that the light had been turned off. There were 2 small corridors leading to the bedrooms, on the left and right side of the staircase. James's room was on the left side, and the light switch was just outside his room. I turned the corner to flick the switch, and there in the darkness, in complete silence, was James. He stood in the corner, with his eyes as wide as he could possibly hold them. I'm a big guy, 6'3", and I weigh about 220 pounds, but in that moment, I was really creeped out. I spoke calmly to James and asked him what he was doing. For a while, he said nothing at all. Then, as I turned the light back on, he let out an ear-piercing scream and started slapping himself around the face. The sleep-in staff woke up and helped me to calm the situation and get James back into bed before reassuring the other residents that everything was fine. After that night, I had 4 days off. My shift pattern was 7 days on, 2 days off, followed by 8 days on and 4 days off. I was relieved that the incident happened just as my time off began. I got back to work the following week and was told that the situation with James had gotten a lot worse. He would spend hours staring at the window that overlooked the garden, just saying, "Little girl, where are you, little girl?" We still didn't know where he had heard that phrase. That night, at around 3 a.m., the alarm went off to say that door number 5 had opened. That was the spare room. That instantly seemed a bit weird, because the door to the spare room was always locked. I went up to investigate and found James standing in the room in the dark. He didn't seem to notice me and just stood there whispering, "Where are you?" over and over again. I gently touched his shoulder and said something like, "Come on, mate. Let's get you back to bed. It's late." James turned around and started heading back to his room, and for a second, I was relieved. But then, as I locked the door to the spare room, he screamed out, "Oh no." He started pummeling the door with both fists. When he did this, the alarm went off to indicate that the front door had been opened. The only people with a key to the front door were myself and the house manager. The door has 4 locks on it, 2 that require a key, and 2 that require an electronic ID card. It was now 3:25 in the morning, and the manager never came in before 8 a.m., so I presume there must have been some kind of mistake. I stayed with James and continued trying to defuse the situation. He finally calmed down and went back into his room. I went downstairs to check the front door. To my surprise, it was wide open. I shut it immediately and started checking every room in the house in case someone had gotten in. I then checked on each of the residents to make sure they were all still in the house. Everything was fine. The next night, everything was calm until around 2 a.m. when one of the other residents, Connor, got up and said that somebody was tapping on his window. I thought he must have been dreaming because his room was on the 3rd floor of the house and it was at least 25 feet from the ground. I went back up to his room to reassure him and checked his window. Sure enough, it was shut and the security lock was still sealed. As he got back into bed, I heard footsteps on the stairs outside his room. He froze for a second and looked at me with an expression of pure panic on his face. I opened the door to see what it was, but there was no one there. He was clearly scared by this and said, "Is he back?" My blood ran cold and asked, "Is who back? What do you mean?" Connor looked over my shoulder and then sank into his bed, pulling his duvet up to his mouth. I turned around to see what he was looking at, but there was still no one there. "Tell him to go away," Connor said in a hushed, scared voice. I tried to reassure him that there was no one there, and left his bedside lamp on before leaving the room. I went downstairs and sat outside on the patio with a cup of coffee. It was the middle of January, and it was around -2 outside, but I felt I had to get out of that place for a while. After around 40 minutes, I went back inside and washed my cup in the sink. I dried it and then put it back in the cupboard. Beneath the cupboard was a locked drawer, which is where we kept all the sharp knives. The drawer was slightly open. This was obviously a major issue, because none of the residents were allowed to access the knife drawer without supervision. I counted the knives and realized that there was one missing, so I woke up the sleep-in staff and told her the situation, then we began to search. Nearly 2 hours later, we still hadn't found the missing knife, so we decided to just keep our guard up and make sure none of the residents were hiding it. 2 hours later, at 5:30 a.m., the alarm sounded. It was the door to the spare room again. We went up to check it out and found out that the door was locked. How could the alarm have been activated by the door opening if it was still locked? I went inside and turned the lights on. To this day, I have no explanation for what I found. The bed had been pushed from its usual place. It was against the wall, and the wardrobe doors were open. There were screws and nails all over the floor, but nothing was broken. The most disturbing part, though, was that in the middle of the room, there was a children's doll, a gold bracelet, and the missing knife from the kitchen. The doll was an old-style baby doll. My guess is that it was made in the 50s, in the style of the clothes and the overall look. The bracelet was simple, but old-looking. I left everything as it was and reported it to the manager as soon as she arrived. No one ever claimed that the bracelet belonged to them, and it was soon taken to a charity shop along with the doll. After the doll and bracelet were removed from the house, James seemed to calm down and never mentioned the little girl or stood in the dark again. I still don't have an explanation for everything that happened. Sometimes I think it was just a combination of strange behavior from a young autistic guy and the fact that the house was old. But on the other hand, a lot of the stuff that happened can't be explained logically. My only regret now is that the doll and bracelet are gone and can't be examined or identified. Maybe it was paranormal. Who knows? But now I work day shifts, and I don't plan on working the night shift again anytime soon. The night shift at the gas station was always quiet and uneventful, but that's what I liked about it. I was the only one working, and I had the place to myself. I would stock the shelves, clean the floors, and wait for the occasional customer to come in. It was the perfect job for someone like me who enjoyed the solitude of the night. But tonight was different. The weather was terrible. A raging storm was sweeping through the area, and the power had gone out. I was stuck in the gas station alone after dark. I tried to keep busy, but the silence was deafening. All I could hear was the muffled noise from the heavy rain. As the storm raged on, I started to hear strange noises coming from outside. I tried to ignore them, but they were getting louder and closer. I could hear something scratching at the door, and I knew I had to investigate. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly made my way to the door. When I opened it, a gust of wind blew in, drenching me in rain. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, but I could hear something breathing heavily. I froze, not sure what to do. And then out of nowhere, a figure burst into the store. I stumbled back and fell to the ground. I was sure I was going to die. But as the figure got closer, I managed to get a look at him. All I could see was a dark outline, but it was a man, a giant of a man. He was at least 6'5" with wild hair and a bushy beard. He wore a large coat, but even without it, I'm sure he would have been huge. I scurried behind the counter and sounded the alarm, but I knew help was minutes away, and I didn't have minutes. I scanned the place for the guy, but I lost him. I could hear him though, and his movements sounded close. I knew that I had to find a weapon, something to defend myself. Found a baseball bat and brandished it in front of me. The man let out an amused laugh and lunged at me again. I swung the bat with all my might, and it connected with him and made a sickening thud. He let out a final cry and fell to the ground motionless. I couldn't tell where I got him, but I didn't want to stay and find out. I ran out of that place and down the street. I was drenched in rain in less than a minute. Suddenly, I noticed the flashing red and blue lights that I'd been waiting for. It felt like an eternity since I'd called, but looking back, I know it was probably less than 5 minutes. I walked back to the store to meet the police. When I got there, my attacker was gone. I turned over the surveillance footage to the police, but since the power was still out, we couldn't watch it on the spot. However, the police were never able to find the guy. I was lucky to have escaped with my life, but I know that I'll never be the same again. The memory of that night will haunt me forever, and I'll always be looking over my shoulder, wondering when the man will return. I quit my job at the gas station and never went back. I've been a security guard for over a decade now, and in that time, I've seen some strange things, but nothing could have prepared me for the night when this story took place. It was 2018, and I was working the night shift at a hotel downtown. The job was really easy. I was really into sci-fi books at the time, and I had a lot of time to read. There was a security office at the back of the building, which is where I spent most of my time. Other than that, I would do a few patrols of the building and the parking lots every few hours throughout the evening. It was a typical quiet night at the hotel, and I was making my rounds, checking doors and windows, when I heard a loud noise coming from the parking lot. At first, I thought it might be a car backfiring, but as the noise continued, I knew something was wrong. It was 2:30 in the morning, and the place was an absolute ghost town. Any noise at all stood out like a sore thumb, so those loud thuds I was hearing in the parking lot were very concerning. I immediately called the police and then headed towards the source of the noise. As I approached the parking lot, I saw a figure in a hoodie trying to break into a car. My heart was pounding in my chest as I shone my flashlight at him, and I ordered him to stop. As soon as I got those words out, he took off running. I chased after him, my breaths coming in gasps as I tried to keep up. I just needed to stay with him long enough for the police to show up. He was fast, and I was starting to lose ground when he suddenly disappeared. I stopped and shone my flashlight in every direction, but I saw no sign of him. Just when I thought I lost him, I heard a faint noise coming from a nearby alley. My hand went to my weapon, which was a can of pepper spray, as I cautiously approached. That's when I saw him. The man was hiding behind a dumpster, trying to catch his breath. I ordered him to surrender, but he refused. He came at me with a wild look in his eyes, and then he jumped on me. Before I knew it, we were rolling around on the ground fighting. I was cursing myself for following this man. I should have waited for the police, I thought. The man was strong, but I was able to overpower him and subdue him until the cops arrived. The man turned out to be a wanted felon with a long history of violence and theft. It's been a few years now, but I still think about that night. The feeling of fear, the adrenaline rush, and the physical struggle with the criminal will always be part of me. I'm grateful for the training I received, and I know it helped me handle the situation as best I could. But I also know that being a security guard is more than just making rounds and checking doors. It's about being prepared for anything and being able to handle dangerous situations, rare as they may be. When I was 20 years old, I was working at a gas station on the other side of town from where I lived. I had recently finished high school, and I took a night shift as a way to make extra money, since my main job didn't pay very much. The gas station was open all night, but my shift was from 7 p.m. until midnight, which worked out well since my other job ended at 5. Sounds like a rough schedule, and it was, but if I'm being completely honest, the work was really easy. It was made even better by the fact that I really got along with all my coworkers. The actual store never got very busy, since most people would pay at the pump anyway. The night was usually a combination of scrolling through Instagram and cracking jokes with my coworker, occasionally being interrupted by a customer asking where the bathroom is. The late shifts always had 2 workers, not because it was busy, but for safety reasons. It's always best to have another person around to watch your back, and my coworkers and I took this responsibility very seriously. This incident took place on a Thursday night at around 11 p.m. It was me and one other guy, John. He was younger than me, 18 I think, and he was still in high school. He had short red hair and a smooth face. I don't think he even needed to shave yet. I'd been working there longer than him, and we had kind of a big brother, little brother dynamic between us. He would ask me how to do everything, even though I'm pretty sure he was smart enough to figure it out for himself. It was the middle of August, and even though it was late at night, the store was incredibly hot. Because of that, we would often prop open the door to the back alley. That way there would be some nice airflow whenever someone walked in the front door. Always a welcome relief from the summer heat. All that being said, John and I had a great time talking and joking around when the store was empty during the late hours. I was at the front of the store tidying up some of the shelves, and John was in the back organizing the stock room when I noticed 2 cars pull up to the front of the store. One of them was an old sedan with some noticeable rust spots on the body. The other was a white minivan with tinted windows. The minivan went to one of the pumps, and the car was parked in one of the spots at the front. I quickly finished what I was doing and made my way back to the counter in case one of them needed to pay for something. At this point, I was not sure if the 2 were together, and I suspected that they probably were because very few customers come in at this hour, and 2 vehicles coming at the same time was unusual to say the least. I waited for a few minutes, and eventually, a single man walked into the store. He was a short guy, probably 30 years old, and thin as a twig. He was wearing a white tank top and baggy blue jeans that seemed at least a few sizes too big. He looked straight at me with a blank look on his face. The man walked towards me, not breaking eye contact. As he approached the counter, I saw him reach behind his back, and before I knew it, I was staring down the barrel of a handgun. The store had a silent alarm that could be activated discreetly, but I was a few steps away from it, and I couldn't risk making a move. John was in the back, and I knew he could hear whatever was going on in the store, so I said loudly, "No problem, sir. Don't shoot. Take whatever you want." That should have been enough for John to call the police. However, when I said that, the man rolled his eyes and smiled. Then he looked over to the side. I turned to look in the same direction, and what I saw was an unconscious John being carried out from the back by a second man. He must have come in through the open back door. That was when they asked for the money. I promptly opened the cash register and emptied it into a bag and handed it to one of them. Then I filled another bag with all the lottery tickets and handed that to him as well. The man holding John then said to me that if I didn't call the police, they would let him go safely. After that, both men walked out the front door, one of them still carrying John, and both cars took off. I stood there for what felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. I hesitated to call the police because of what the man said. However, I soon decided that I needed to call them, so I dialed 911 and reported the incident. The police arrived within minutes and reviewed the security footage. I waited as patiently as I could, considering the circumstances. Not long after, one of the officers told me that they were able to see the license plate from one of the cars. Not the smartest criminals, I guess. Later that night, I learned that both men were caught by the police, and I was brought into the station to identify them. A tremendous sense of relief washed over my entire body when I saw both those guys standing in a lineup. I quickly chose the two men who were not clever enough to cover their faces. After that, I asked one of the officers where John was. He looked at me with a solemn expression and placed his right hand on my shoulder. Then he told me that John had never been found. Search parties worked day and night for the next several days, but they turned up nothing, and eventually they were called off. To this day, no one knows what happened to him because neither of the men ever talked and no evidence was found. It has weighed heavily on my conscience ever since. John and I were meant to watch out for each other, and I can't help but feel that I failed him. I always wonder if things would have turned out differently had I not called the police, as one of the men said. Maybe they would have let him go, maybe not. I think not knowing is the hardest part of all, and I have to deal with that every day. My first job was at the gas station down the street from my high school. I worked Thursday and Friday evenings every week. My shifts were 6 p.m. until midnight. Even though the schedule did interfere with my schoolwork, my parents allowed it because they thought it would be good for me to get some work experience. After my first few weeks on the job, I would be alone for the last 2 hours of my shift. There was another guy who would be there until 10 p.m. That was fine with me because it was usually really dead by that time. I was standing behind the counter, staring at my phone one night at around 11 p.m. Suddenly, the door opened and a man walked in. He was tall, probably 6'2", with a long dirty coat and sunglasses. He wore a brimmed hat and also had a long beard, so I couldn't really see much of his face. My first thought was that he was going to rob the place, because it looked like he had made some effort to conceal his appearance. The guy slowly walked up and down the aisles, then he stood in the back of the store, next to the coffee machine. He just stood there. He didn't buy anything, and he never said a word to me, or so much as looked in my direction. At 5 minutes to close, he simply walked out the front door the way he came. I didn't even have to ask him to leave. I was relieved when he left, but obviously creeped out. Why would anybody just stand in a store for an hour without buying anything? I guess it was not technically against any of our rules, but it was incredibly frightening for me, especially since I was alone. On my next shift, I asked my coworker if he had seen anything similar. Since he was more experienced than me, I figured he might have seen the guy before. My coworker told me that he had never seen anybody like that. That night, when I was alone again, the same creepy guy came in and did the same thing. He walked in the front door at around 10:30 p.m. and stood there silently. Several customers came in during that time, but I suppose it would not look as strange to them since they were only in there for a minute or two. Just like last time, he left without any incident 5 minutes before close. Over my next few shifts, the same thing happened each and every time. I came to expect it. From time to time, I would try to talk to the guy, but he would never respond. He wouldn't even look at me. I stood behind the counter one night. The creepy guy was standing on the other side of the store as usual. I can't even describe how awkward it was being alone with this guy night after night. We had probably spent over 10 hours together alone, collectively, since I started the job. Just like usual, he left a few minutes before closing time. After he left, I walked over to the front door and locked it. Then I spent the next half hour or so on my closing routine. I emptied the garbage cans and did a quick sweep of the floors. Then I emptied the cash register and got it ready for deposit on my way home. When I stepped out of the store, I looked out to see my car alone in the dark parking lot. I was parked on the far side, past the pumps. I started walking towards my car, and suddenly I started to feel like I was being watched. Just then, someone ran out from the darkness and stood in front of me, blocking my car. It was that same guy from before, the one who just stood there in the store with me every night. As soon as I saw him, I ran back to the store, unlocked the door, and scurried inside. When I was in there, I locked the door and called my dad for help. While I was waiting, I looked out the large glass window at the front, and I could see that the guy was still standing in the exact spot where I last saw him. He hadn't moved. After about 10 minutes, my dad's car pulled up, and his headlights fell upon the guy. The guy's face was completely lit for a split second, and when that happened, he took off running. To this day, I have no idea where he went. That was the last time I ever worked at that gas station, and from then on, I refused to take any night shifts at my other jobs. The people you run into are just way too scary. I have no idea who that guy was, or what he wanted, but in my opinion, he was not all there, and I don't know what he was capable of. This story takes place one night when I stopped for gas on my way home from work. I worked at a restaurant, so I was usually there until late, sometimes after midnight. This time it was about 11:30 at night. I would pass this gas station every day on my way home from work, and I'm pretty sure it was open 24/7. The store part of the gas station was bigger than most. It was almost like a tiny grocery store because it had a decent selection of food, not just the junk food and snacks like some others. This place even had a tiny produce aisle. Because of that, I would often pick up some things there after filling up my car, since other places in the area were usually closed at the time. I was walking down the aisles of the store while my car was parked outside. I filled my basket with a few of the essentials that I always buy: bananas, eggs, and bread. Then I walked around for a while, trying to decide if there was anything else that I wanted. I eventually made my way to the till and paid for my gas, as well as the grocery items. Then I walked out the large glass door at the front of the store. I could see that my car was parked next to one of the pumps. The parking lot was dark, but the bright lights from the gas pumps were like a bright oasis. I started walking towards my car, and as I got closer, I could tell that there was somebody sitting in my back seat. I don't usually lock my doors when I go in, because it's usually pretty quick, but this time, I was in there for a while, longer than normal. Also, my car is pretty old, so you have to lock them all manually. I know it's not smart, but those are my excuses, so take it for what you will. I inched closer to get a look at the person. It appeared to be an older woman, hunched over. Her hair was covering most of her face, and the shade from the roof of my car formed a dark corner in the back seat where she was sitting. So it was hard to tell much about her. My first thought was that it was an elderly woman who wandered into my car, confused. I stood a few feet away from the car while I thought about the situation. I considered simply giving her a ride to wherever she was going. I'm always willing to help people in need, but some part of me thought that was not a good idea. After a minute or two, I decided to call the police. I'd hate to get the police involved for something like this, and I made sure that they knew it was not an emergency or anything. Also, I did not want to press any charges. When the police arrived, I talked to the officers for a few minutes. After that, they told me to wait by the building to give them some distance. I couldn't see much from there, and the bodies of the two police officers were blocking what little view I might have had. I could tell that they opened the back door of my car, and before I knew it, they had pulled the person out of the back seat and put her in handcuffs. I thought that was unnecessary, so I ran over shouting for them to stop. In my mind, it was just a confused old woman who wandered into my car by accident. But as I got closer, I could tell that it was not a woman at all. It was an older man, probably 50 or 60 years old, with long gray hair and several large tattoos on his face and hands. For some reason that I never figured out, he seemed to be wearing a hospital gown over his clothes. I stopped in my tracks when I realized that, then one of the officers yelled at me to stay back. I backed up a few steps and continued to watch in disbelief. My heart sank when I noticed something. When the man was being frisked, I saw them remove a large hunting knife from under his clothes. He was definitely planning something for me, something that I wanted no part of. It's very scary to think that I almost got into the car with that guy sitting back there. Luckily, I made the right decision, and I survived to tell about it. This happened just over a month ago. I was hanging out at my friend Jaden's house with some other guys. There were 5 or 6 of us there. I lived kind of far away, but everyone else lived in his neighborhood. I borrowed my dad's car to get there. My friends all had a few drinks, but I had to drive, so I couldn't. At around midnight, we called it a night. I hopped into the car and said goodbye to my friends. My dad always lets me borrow his car, but he asks that I put some gas in to make up for what I use. A fair rule. I was driving down one of the larger streets in my town. There were stores and restaurants on both sides. All were closed for the night, though. It was quite deserted. I noticed a gas station on the right, and I figured it was as good a place as any to fill up. I pulled into the farthest pump. As I got out, I noticed a car at the station. It was the only other one there. I looked over to it as I was filling up my car. It was dark blue, with tinted windows. I couldn't see anybody inside, but the headlights were on, so I figured someone was there. As I was getting back into the driver's seat, I saw the car pull up next to me. The front window rolled down. The driver was wearing a mask. I couldn't see his face. He didn't say anything, and neither did I. It was really awkward. I tried to start my car and get out of there, but I fumbled with the ignition. I looked up and saw that the car was still there, waiting for me. I finally got my car started and began driving. After a few minutes, I looked back and I saw that the car was behind me. My first thought was to drive to the police station. That's what my mom always told me to do in a situation like this. I thought I remembered how to find it, but after a while, I found myself lost and the car was still on my tail. I felt like I was driving in circles, lost in the middle of nowhere. I tried to keep calm. The fear was overwhelming. I had meandered all the way into a very rural area. There were farm fields on either side, with tall corn stalks closing in on the road. I felt trapped, and I was